So I am going to talk about left behind places. It's interesting to hear that the north of England is part of your research area. I know Andy Pike and the folk at Newcastle pretty well. And I think Liverpool tells a very interesting story of a place that was left behind to a stage that people would think there is no reason for a city this size to exist anymore, and it should be towed out into the Atlantic and sunk, to a place that perhaps is no longer left behind, or is it? I'm then going to talk about some of the diverse economies scholarship that I'm interested in and give some thoughts about Liverpool and Leipzig. There's a song by the Oyster Band called From Leipzig to Little Rock, and it came out in 1989, and it was about the amazing transitions that went on in this city in 1989. I was at the Runde Ecke yesterday looking at the Stasi Museum, and it very much inspired ideas that perhaps there are alternative ideas out there that eventually become ones worth thinking about. I'm 61 for my sins, so I was 18 in 1980, 1981 when the Solidarność experiment happened. I remember very well martial law being declared, and I remember listening to the radio as an 18-year-old where the DJ John Peel played a song called New Dawn Fades by Joy Division, and he said, and we're thinking of everybody in Poland tonight. And then just around the time I did my master's, it was the transition 1989, 1990, 1991. I did a tour through Czechoslovakia, as it was back then in 1991, and went to Dresden and to Jena, and then drove in a Trabant back to Cologne. So I'm very interested in places with a radical past and way these ideas are still useful for the 21st century and the 22nd century when we're thinking about the Anthropocene. So I'm not going to be talking about environmentalism a little bit at the moment, but I am going to be talking about how we can live well within the problems that we've got and allow future generations and other species to live well. So the argument I'm going to give is that since 1989, well, since way before that, since back to the 19th century, we've had left behind places that the capitalist system doesn't seem to be able to provide well for. Or we have cities with hotspots in the middle of them and parts of them that are not very well looked after at all. And what can we be doing about that? And in a way, it's sort of kind of sad that we're still talking about that after 1989. Surely we know after 1989 the future is markets and the future is entrepreneurship and the future is freedom, and then everything will be okay. Walking around Leipzig, I've seen plenty of evidence that everything is not okay after all those hopes of 1989. But the alternative at the electoral level, and I'm thinking of Brexit, and I'm thinking of PIS in Poland, and I'm thinking of AfD in Germany, seems to be that the arguments are that left behind people have not been included in the liberal dream, and they are derided, disrespected, given no esteem whatsoever. They're all a bunch of racists that voted for Brexit and now in danger of voting for AfD. And I want to know, what are we doing in the left that means this is the case? And are there ideas that are being developed on the ground that if you open your eyes and look for them, you might find some better ideas? I'm not telling you that they are the better ideas, I'm just asking the question, is there something to be worked on over there? And I think in Liverpool, I can tell you a story of an effervescence of radical ideas when Liverpool was starting to be left behind in the 1960s and the 1970s and the 1980s, when the Boeing 747 replaced the liner, when containerisation replaced dock work, And when Britain joined the European Union, which meant the city was then marooned on the wrong side of the country, because all the business would be coming into Harwich and Hull out of Hamburg and Europort. And I want to know what a progressive alternative coming from the diverse economies tradition might look like. While everybody knows that capitalism can be problematic, we perhaps don't want to be spending all our time thinking about analysing the problems, the structural problems that capitalism has caused, because we kind of know that, and it doesn't really help. Which doesn't mean we don't think capitalism doesn't exist and there aren't problems with it, but that's not the point. It's perhaps capitalocentric to assume that because there is capitalism in an economy, everything is capitalist. It's a bit totalising. And if you do, as I've done over the past 4 days, walk around cities like Leipzig, you'll find plenty of alternatives if you open your eyes up and see them. And it's also saying that what you want is a more aspirational and reparative way of thinking about the world, which is not paranoid that everything you do will inevitably be destroyed by capitalism or right-wing populism, but be open to the idea that there is good stuff out there if you find it, and what the job to do is to build it. So that's what I want to talk about. So first half of the lecture, I just want to talk about what we found out in Liverpool. A lot of British people think of Liverpool as a basket case, as excuse my French, as a shithole, as dirty, smelly, and not very nice. I've heard plenty of people talking about Leipzig in the 1990s as being a fairly problematic place. But both cities have got very, very beautiful buildings. This is the waterfront at Liverpool, the first skyscraper in Europe and the second skyscraper in the world after the Flatiron in New York. So in the 19th century, people used to talk about Manchester men and Liverpool gentlemen, because Liverpool was the global port that was, to put it colloquially, stinking rich, based on the slavery of black and brown bodies out to the Americas. So it was a place that was doing very, very well in the 19th century. But it was also a place, if you take a non-capitalist-centric and not structural view, that had plenty of community-based things going on there. So this is a picture from Walton Road, which is in the north part of the city, which is not doing very well, which is still pretty left behind, of the cooperative stores owned and controlled by the members, and the members would have been working class people. It's a place where we had Dr. Duncan, who did some of the first health reforms of UK cities, really looking at the health of ordinary people. We had Kitty, who set up a community wash house in the north part of the city that's now got a social enterprise named after her. And we got a small part of the town, which I'd like to show you a picture of social housing built in the 19th century, early 20th century, that looks very much like the workers' housing in Vienna. And Liverpool is a place where lots of innovation happened about social enterprise. So it's a city that was stinking rich with real inequalities, but also a place where interesting things were happening. But by the 1970s, as I say, the combination of the 747, containerisation and joining the European Union meant the place was really, really struggling. And it felt like that the city had been the experiment of every single attempt to make things better that had been done. So since the 1960s, the city has been the recipient or victim of literally every urban policy that had been tried. What was particularly interesting for this discussion was an analysis that came out of the early 1970s of what to do about left-behind places like the northern part of Liverpool. And that was a very structuralist analysis that says this is a capitalist crisis. And it was a capitalist crisis. You can't argue that it wasn't a capitalist crisis. But what happened was in parts of Liverpool, teams of social scientists and social workers would work with urban development practitioners looking to develop bottom-up grassroots analysis of how you work very locally in left-behind places. And the left-behind places in Liverpool were places of extreme poverty. Many places hadn't yet developed since what was happening in the Blitz in 1942 and after that. So extreme problems. What people did was two things. They said, what we want is to develop ways that people can be getting in control of their lives. There was a big emphasis on cooperatives, on community-based forms of economic development, of critiques of the local state as being top-down, as being paternalist, as being one-size-fits-all, very focused on keeping women in their place in the home, so very patriarchal, very, very paternalist. And an argument that what we can get is a form of social economy which is starting to be more creative. Very interesting politics that I noticed in Leipzig recently was around adventure playgrounds. So spaces for children to be children, places for children to learn and grow. So the whole emphasis there from these social scientists was of the social economy as being a place for democratisation. At the same time, they located the problem within capitalist crisis. So the famous report they did was this one, Gilding the Ghetto. That's James Callaghan, the Prime Minister at the time. But it was really starting to say that what we need to focus on is the role of the state in keeping places like this very, very, very poor, and a critique of capitalist thinking. And saying that what we're doing is local actions in particular areas that are worthy, but they don't really challenge the fundamental problems of the capitalist crisis that is putting Liverpool where it is. And I don't really have a problem with that. I wrote a book in the early 2000s where we were looking at the crisis in Liverpool, and I won't read this quote out for you, but we're talking about a city that the capitalist system was economically devastating to the level that the place was dirty. The place was full of litter. The journalist Bill Bryson said he came to Liverpool and he noticed that the residents were having a litter party. It was dirty, it was smelly, the buildings were covered with dirt, they were brown. Particularly Liverpool is located on a tidal estuary, the River Mersey. There were buildings that you'll see in a moment, they were filled up with silt, and the place literally stank. So I think certain left behind places can have an atmosphere, and it's an atmosphere of contamination, of dirt, of filth, of hopelessness, that absolutely nothing can work. Everything is going to be going downhill. And people can feel that literally they are at the end of capitalism or at the end of the world. So this was a socialist activist I spoke to that said he remembers going to school in 1978 at the height of the crisis, always walking past a picket line, always walking past workers on strike. And then they shut everything down. They shut Standards No. 2, car factory. They shut Dunlop's, making tyres. And they were big headlines. The amount of workers that were thrown out of work on that industrial estate, you felt like everything was collapsing around you. It was very real. My dad worked at Metal Box, a factory. He was coming home from work saying, they've just announced 200 redundancies. When is our family going to be next? It felt like capitalism is collapsing around you. And around that time, that was actually very, very radicalising. This was before the end of the Cold War. Book there I wrote there, Militant Liverpool, A City on the Edge, about what happened in Liverpool in 1983 and 1984. Where a left-wing Trotskyist element within the British Labour Party got elected to the council in Liverpool very popularly, feeling that the city has got its problems and something needs to be done about that, which is that the Conservative government needs to come up with more money. And the Conservative minister did come to Liverpool on the basis of mass demonstrations in the town centre in 1983 and 1984. Some people say 70,000. I understand that was the same number of people outside the Hauptbahnhof in October 1989, where the police withdrew. So very similar feeling. And the Tory minister said that, yeah, I've seen ways that are not appropriate for civilised living in the 21st century. So the council did win some extra money, but it really felt that it was wanting to challenge the capitalist system. It wasn't going to be in the business of managing capitalism in a way that it thought was appropriate, and it felt it wanted to carry on fighting. So what eventually happened was that the council was disbarred from being in government by the government. They were thrown out, and the argument was over the next few years that we should have a very more sensible, traditional form of Labour government in Liverpool, Labour Council in Liverpool. Meant, as you see here, this is the docks that I was telling you about earlier. If you look at the silt, the River Mersey, not too bad here, but imagine the smell of that and just look at the dereliction, everything that's going around here. This is a picture of the police lines of the Toxteth uprising or riots, depending how you want to call it, in the early 1980s, where the black community of Liverpool rose up against police violence, and the city burnt for 4 or 5 days. And the solution from the government around that time to Left Behind Places was this, the Liverpool Garden Festival in 1984. It's very nice. I lived just down the road from the site where it once was. It was very pretty. You could go along, have a nice day out for free and go on the different fun rides, see the Japanese garden, see the different styles of things happening. But you got an argument that the government was prepared to say to Liverpool, yes, we get this. We understand that there are fundamental problems with your city. We will give you a little bit of extra money. Now go away and keep quiet. Run the city within the confines of the system as it is at the moment. So that critique of gilding the ghetto seemed to be something that was accepted. Left Behind Places can shout, they'll get a little bit of extra money, but they won't really get what is necessarily structurally to get where they need to be. They'll get a nice little festival garden. Thankfully, that's not the only story, because we're also part of the European Union back then. And by 1994, people had recognised that the structural problems on Merseyside were significant, were fundamental, and it's not really good enough to just come along and set up a festival garden and tell the council to be quiet and play by the rules. Big structural funds coming in from Europe as part of Objective 1, which was Merseyside and Northern Ireland as the only structurally left behind places. 181 million funding in the town between 1994 and 2015. So you might think, yes, we're starting to get there. A lot of it was focused on the city centre. So this doesn't look like that anymore. This has now been cleaned out, and it's the biggest number of listed buildings in Britain outside Bath. All the way along the port here, you can see the edge of the Three Graces here. There's the new Museum of Liverpool here now. There's the Museum of Liverpool here. So you've got a lot of city centre regeneration. Doesn't look like that. It's now a big shopping centre built by the private sector with a fair bit of European money coming in here. So the city is doing a lot better. So there was that argument that, yeah, you need to address the structural problems that have been left over by the fact that the 747 has replaced the liner, that there is now containerisation, and we're in the European Union. And there was a lot of investment, so the buildings in the centre no longer stunk. They now look pretty nice. But people also wanted to think about the communities of North Liverpool. And people wanted to look at this idea of ABCD, or asset-based community development. So looking at what communities in Left Behind Places thought about how they wanted to live. It might not necessarily be how do we get you into a business. It might not be about how we get you into a job, but asking kind of questions about how do you want to live, what resources have you already got in your communities if we look and see them, how can we make them better, how can we resource them, how can we provide better lives to people. So this was the book by Cressman and McKnight, Building Communities from the Inside Out, Path Towards Finding and Mobilising Community Assets. So if as part of your project you haven't engaged with the ABCD approach, then you very probably need to, but I'm sure I'm teaching Granny to suck eggs here. I'm sure you have looked at that. So the first version of Objective 1 was criticised locally. Nobody had any problem particularly with the investment in the city centre, but people said if you just invest in the city centre and leave the rest of the communities left behind, you're going to have a problem. The concerns there was that the agenda was being set by the UK government and by the EU. This was a time when the Liverpool Council was seen as still suffering from the problems of the militant years and not taken seriously. This isn't recorded, is it? Probably that's a fair comment given that the quality of the local leadership at that time. But there was a sense that the ideas were generic and they were not based enough on place. And by place we mean the particular communities of North Liverpool. It wasn't inclusive enough. This was the public sector doing to communities. It wasn't really engaging with those communities, and particularly it also wasn't engaging with the private sector. It wasn't understanding that there are people running enterprises in these kind of places that might have a point to say. It wasn't innovative enough. This was the neoliberal era, so it was about competitiveness. People in left behind places aren't competitive enough. We need to raise the competitive gap. They don't have the skills. We need to give them the skills to get mainstream jobs. They're not enterprising enough. There's something about people from Liverpool, they don't set up businesses. So the business support rates are lower than in other places, but if you look at ways people get by using an asset-based community development approach, you'll find plenty of innovative people doing things, some of which you might not like. It was very bureaucratic. EU forms, pretty long. Particularly what was the major problem was gaining access to matched funding, to access EU money. And it was dominated by professional money chasers demanding more of the same. A later initiative from the Labour government was called the New Deal for Communities, was called the New Deal for Consultants. And that was probably a fair description of what was going on here. There would be professional money chasers demanding more of the same. If you don't fund more of the same, everything's going to go wrong. But people listened and developed these new ideas based on the concept of working with the people of Merseyside. And these different pathways to integration. So you'll have picked up the argument here that the way to help left behind places is to integrate them with the mainstream. So what was particularly interested here was giving pots of money to new neighbourhood-based communities that will be able to control and manage what they were doing themselves, which was new. Doing something different from the traditional training courses developed by the public sector. So there's pathways to integration, neighbourhood-focused packages of targeted support for the most socially excluded communities, pathways to education, emphasising links between education and work, pathways to skills, pre-vocational training, pathways to training, and pathways to job. What was particularly interesting there was a focus on ILMs, which I'm sure you're aware of, employment subsidies, community and commercial businesses, and focuses on childcare. So there was also money for social enterprises, for community-based development organisations, for local currencies, which was interesting, for credit unions. So it was starting to engage a little bit more with that asset-based community development approach. Block grants to 38 local pathways partnerships would allocate the funding. and going beyond a competitiveness agenda by not seeing the people in those communities as just left behind and as lacking, but as people that did have ideas but needed to be supported into a new future. But the new future was always paid work or enterprise. A diverse economist perspective would want to say, is that all there is? A little bit more about that later. But this looks like a step forward to me with Objective 1. Big influence there was by the former professor of geography, Peter Lloyd, and Richard Meegan. And you can read their stuff, and it's all pretty useful stuff, yeah. So, if you say what we're going to do is give blocks of money to community-based organisations to work up projects based on local needs as identified by themselves, using an asset-based community development approach, how did it work out? Well, of course, things are never perfect, are they? Knowsley is the eastern parts of Merseyside conurbation. It doesn't have a city centre, it's lots of small towns, some of which think they should be in Lancashire, not be in Merseyside. It's a big car factory, Jaguar Land Rover in the south of the borough, and the rest of it is this sort of strip around Liverpool, full of classic small town left behind communities. And the issue there, and this is, I'm drawing on the work of Phil Boland here, the problems of the bureaucratic process and the time that was necessary to work up these projects really made it difficult for communities to struggle with, to deal with that. So there's a lack of time, support and capacity building for the community side to be equal partners. So the private sector, the council side, the professional money chasers, they generally cleaned up. Communities didn't understand the bureaucratic process. It was never explained to them. So they fell back on what the public sector told them that they needed. Sometimes in these kind of communities, you got family networks. You got big families that knew each other, had been there a long time. Could actually turn into cartels at time. And these kind of communities would start to clear up a little bit more. So I had a student from this part of the world, and his surname was, I won't say what it is, but I said, are you from that community? And he said, yeah, can you tell? And I said, yeah, you're a bright lad, and I can tell that you've got these social networks from your family. So what happened was that without the capacity building and time to think about something different, kind of thing I want them to do, they felt back on, what do you want? Ask a community what they want. We want a job. We want a decent job. Fair enough. When that job doesn't appear, because of capitalist processes, you got a problem. People became sceptical, and what they did was they turned in on themselves, and they focused on their families, and they were very cynical. None of this works. That was in Knowsley. Meegan and Mitchell and Evans, looking at Liverpool, found a slightly more interesting process. And they were saying, in time, these communities did get together. It took work, it took time, but in certain places, these family clans and networks came together, recognised that they need to talk to other people, and did develop community-based organisations quite well. So it was a bit pepper-potted. Some communities engaged with it well. Sometimes it was historical reasons why they didn't do it. And sometimes they were able to engage with the pathway partnerships. Some communities in the north of the city, in left behind places, had a long tradition of fighting back, of fighting against a factory closure, of fighting against something happening to their community that they didn't like the look of. And those communities with a history of struggle and a history of cohesiveness, it was the kind of community where people did feel they can do something together. Sometimes you got a local councillor who was well embedded in the community that could support them. Sometimes local social workers, community development workers knew their stuff, and they were able to work perfectly with those communities. In other places, the local state was mistrusted, or other communities were mistrusted, so it was a little bit difficult. So they found out that local politics and personalities matters. Some communities were more cohesive. Some communities were more engaged than others. Some communities were tribal. They didn't like the other local communities. Others felt that we are all in this together and we want to do something a little bit more interesting. Yeah. So some of these communities were able to stop the professional money chasers doing more of the same and do something a little bit more innovative. And in particular, some of these communities, and we can talk about the Eldonians Housing Association, or we can talk about Vauxhall Neighbourhood Council, as sustainable places where this pathways process created spaces for something more interesting to come together over there. So they developed into CBED, community-based economic development, community development corporations that were starting to take this ABC process and do something a little bit more interesting. They said, we don't want more of the same, we want customised training, we want ILMs, perhaps we want to develop let schemes and credit unions. And what Mitchell and Megan and Evans argue is, and they're right, is that there are a number of these organisations that are still around to this day. And these are the kind of organisations that I work with. So Homebaked is a social enterprise bakery right next to Anfield football ground. Next door to it is Kitty's Laundrette, which is drawing on that 19th century tradition to find places for people to come in and clean their washing at a reasonable price when their washing machine breaks down. It does training, and there's a community land trust which they're looking to develop above it. It's quite small, and this one is based on arts, but it's doing good stuff. Granby Street Market is in the middle of Liverpool 8, Toxteth, where the Toxteth uprisings were. People come together every week at a street market, which lots of interesting things happen around, and there's a community land trust in that particular area. This is Squash, formerly Squash Nutrition. This is in Liverpool 8 again. This is a project which is looking to do community gardening, get people thinking about ways of eating well. And Alt Valley Community Trust, I've given the game away there. That's the one named that's run by this family who are very, very well regarded in the area, very effective. That project has a communiversity, it has training for computers, it runs a leisure centre, it has a community garden. That one originally came out of a community-based campaign in the 1970s to save a school. So what we're seeing in Liverpool is, out of this process of struggle, lots of community-based development organisations which are still here and doing well. I could talk about the Eldonians, which built some very interesting housing on an old sugar factory in the north of the city. But that would be a very sad story to tell, because that organisation fell apart as based on the basis of all sorts of kin-based corruption and criminality and problems that I don't want to go into in more detail. But it's a very, 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 very sad story. Some of the more kin-based neighbourhood associations have been struggling. But you can see that these community-based economic development organisations are working quite well. So this might have meant, if you look at the city centre revitalisation, that Liverpool is no longer a left-behind place. So why am I even talking about it? 2008, Liverpool won the Capital of Culture. So this, you would argue, would be getting with David Harvey's Entrepreneurial Cities process. And people said it's like Liverpool and Everton winning the FA Cup, the Beatles reforming, and Steven Spielberg coming to make a play about it, all on the right day. This was the night that they launched the European, the Capital of Culture. We had Ringo Starr playing on top of the town hall. Ringo Starr was asked what he thought about Liverpool, and he said, well, it's still a shithole, isn't it? What do you miss about Liverpool? Nothing. Glad I live in New York. So if anybody in Liverpool says, in Ringo Starr, and everyone says, he's still a one, isn't he? But you could argue that this is the city no longer being left behind. Has it got its mojo back, as the Sunday Times said? It's no longer left behind. So this is what the Albert Dock looks like now. It's kind of nice. This is the big shopping centre that was built in the centre of town with the Duke of Westminster money. It is really working. It's not like a standard out-of-town shopping centre. There's a new park being built on top of the car park that's full of people enjoying their ice creams and the beer on a summer's day. It's recreating the city centre streets. This was amazing. We had a huge spider crawling through the city, which everybody enjoyed. We woke up once morning and we found out that this spider was hanging onto the side of a tower block which was due to be demolished. And the paper said, what's happening? There's a spider in town, come and see. And it was great fun. It had a fight with the JCB using water cannons. And it really did animate the city. So if you think of what I said earlier about a city with an atmosphere of being left behind and everything smells and you feel like it's the end of capitalism, this kind of ain't it. Probably over the summer, the city really did capitalise on everything that had been done over the past 15 years with Eurovision, supporting Ukraine. And it was really nice. It was really, really, really good. So this is what people said. It's a golden age. It's the city's going to boom for a decade. 2016, we had the International Festival for Business, which the Conservative government said, do you want to have it in Liverpool? Because you are the example of everything you do right. So in the 1980s, we thought the law and the law won. Now we're engaging with the entrepreneurial thesis, and a Conservative government is saying, can we have our International Festival for Business here? And the Labour Council says, yes, please. And it goes ahead. So everything's coming up roses. But hang on. You know it's not all about that. The city centre is doing just fine. I live just about here in university lecturer land, very green, very nice. North of the city and to the far south of the city, you've got these huge problems. And it's probably symbolised by the Everton and the Liverpool grounds. Homebait is just about here, where you've still got this divide in the city with sort of a space in the middle that is fairly okay. So we've still got these problems. This was just out last month, the problems of Liverpool residents in terms of their ill health. You can look at the numbers yourself there. City residents are facing spending cuts for more than a quarter of their life. 26.1% are in ill health. Fall in women's life expectancy by 1 year, and a fall in women's healthy life expectancy by 4 years. An increase of up to 38,000 more people living with major illness, designed at least 2 long-term conditions, or high blood pressure, cancer, diabetes, asthma, or chronic liver disease. Double the number of adults experiencing depression. The health issues most common in children related to mental health, obesity, child poverty, and Liverpool is the 3rd most deprived local authority in Britain. 63% of residents living in areas ranked amongst the most deprived in England, and 3 in 10 children living in poverty. So you're doing everything that the entrepreneurial cities thesis says you should do, and you're doing it well. You're doing it really well. You go into the city centre and the city is a party town. We have no trouble recruiting students to the University of Liverpool because it's a great place to be. So the Florida thesis seems to be working very, very, very well in Liverpool. But we've still got this problem. So what we've been seeing in Liverpool is huge struggles. This isn't that the city kept quiet, played with the programme, engaged with the entrepreneurial cities thesis, and everything was okay. This product that Liverpool has got around culture comes out of struggle. You think of the Beatles, working class lads, bit cocky, bit arrogant, democratic from their bootlaces up. That's what the city's got. So you've got a form of creativity that you can use to generate a head of steam to do something interesting in the city, definitely around culture, but also around these community-based economic development organisations that I showed you a little bit earlier. Sometimes, though, people want to not take these grassroots activities, community-based economic development institutions seriously. They think that the state should be doing everything, the government should be doing anything, the funding needs to be coming, or they think that the private sector should be supported a lot more because we need to be engaging with conventional economic indicators like the competitiveness gap, like education, like skills, getting people able to access the well-paid jobs of the future. So you can get both sides, both leftists and more traditional economic development voices, not taking this bottom-up grassroots economic development approach very, very, very seriously. Sometimes you're finding these grassroots activities being very creative, like Kitty's Laundrette, like Home Baked, like Acorn. I've got a real problem. One of the names of these organisations, I can never, ever remember it. Anyway, yeah. Some of them doing very, 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 very well. Some of them are embedded in communities, but some of them can be embedded in these clan networks, these community networks, these family networks. Some of them last very well, like Hawke Valley. Some of them, like the Eldonians, can collapse into all sorts of huge problems. But does that mean you disregard them? Or do you say that's a danger that you need to engage with? Some of these organisations, and they say this themselves, have got very dependent on state funding. And what they would argue is that they have turned into very efficient social entrepreneurs and social enterprises that know how to get the money in, and they play the game really, really, really well. So they're a million miles away from these 1970s radical ideas of grassroots-based anti-capitalist activity. They can be very, very neoliberal. They can critique their cousins and their friends that are always expecting the government or the state to provide a handout to them next. They say, oh, there's just a community or clan network. They expect the council to step in and look after them. And they've just got to stop that. So some people would say what you've got in Liverpool is a group of intelligent policy entrepreneurs around social enterprise who are really smart and really entrepreneurial and know what they're doing. And they're a million miles away from the radical ideas of the 70s or these dependent community-based clan networks. Sometimes they're like cats in a sack. So if you think that like the people in the 1970s did, that what you're going to get is this social enterprise, social economy world turning into a movement for real change in the capitalist system, you've not got that at all. You've got very, very effective business people that sometimes could hang together more than they do at the moment. So the worry is that what you're getting is austerity or the big society naturalised. Everybody thinks this is the way it is. There is no alternative. Whereas there were far more interesting ideas around in the 1970s that we don't listen to anymore. To some extent, Liverpool Council, the local authorities are now pretty competent, which they were not in the late 90s and very different from the very radical group of people around in the 1980s. I didn't say, actually, with regard to this, when you talked to people in the local authority in the 1980s from the militant tendency, what I think they wanted was close to the DDR. And I'm not exaggerating there. They wanted a fully socialist society where the minister would decide what happens. And we're a million miles away from that, where we've got this fairly competent but underfunded local state having around 56% of its funding cut over the last few years. And what we've perhaps got is growth and competitiveness naturalised in a sector that you might have thought would be a little bit more radical than that. So I'm going to just finish off with about 10 minutes on what an alternative might look like, because that's kind of the end of the Liverpool side of this. So let's think of what another city might look like. So the community economies perspective that myself and Marcus are in ask these kind of questions for a project, for a progressive project. What does it mean to live well? How do we want to live? What do we think living well means? If we sort of think of this is not living well, is it? What does living well mean? How do we produce? What do we need? What do we need? What don't we need? How do we create a surplus? Do we think of profit? Do we think of replenishing the commons? Do we think of a surplus? Or do we try to run things without a surplus? How do we share with others? And by others, we mean people far away, people not yet born, other species. How do we maintain the commons, the atmospheric commons, the clean commons, the natural world, other species, so you're not living in a city that's dirty and smelly and polluted and feels like it's literally going nowhere, as Liverpool did in the 1970s and I understand Leipzig did in the 1990s. How do you create a world worth living in and invest in the future? So I wrote a paper in the journal Local Economy, which was starting to play a little bit of a game of, if I apply diverse economies thinking to what I've seen in Liverpool, what would an alternative path for Liverpool, or perhaps Leipzig, be like? So all these community development organisations that were very well established through all that funding and are doing very well, that have quite turned into quite efficient social enterprises. And we know there was a whole process led by the Blair government that wanted to neoliberalise this radical social economy, social enterprise structure into, not structure, network into more of a neoliberal form. So what would happen if these community development organisations were thinking a little bit more about how do people want to live? How do people want to work? And engage in asset-based community development ideas with their communities. And when the community said, we want a job, and then you say, well, there isn't a job, what can we do? Could that work? This process has created a whole network of credit unions across the city, but they are very much poor people's banks. What if we created all sorts of other financial institutions? We tried local currencies in the form of let schemes, so let's not worry a little bit too much about that. Or think of other ways that people can share with each other, co-create things, work in gardens, set up community businesses, doing something a little bit more interesting. No emphasis at all on cooperatives in Liverpool at all. I've seen those around Leipzig. What is it about Leipzig? Went to a very interesting furniture co-op in the south of the city. Why in Liverpool is everything turning into a social enterprise or a social trading organisation that's losing the democracy and losing the community side of things? We've got the bins, the rubbish is collected by a state-owned, local state-owned company, which is good. Why not more cooperatives delivering those kind of services? We've got in Liverpool, we've got the transition movement, which is looking to engage with ways we can live well in the Anthropocene. A whole lecture on transition enterprises, the ways that we could do more of that. Could we be developing more local food and power? I don't know. Another city might look a little bit more different to that. I think we're probably not there yet. If we think of 1945, nobody took free market capitalism seriously at all. 1990, no one took communism seriously at all. So there are two ways within recent history that whole areas of economic life were deemed out of place, not to be taken seriously. So since the 1990s, that form of state-owned communism of Eastern Germany has gone. I say thank goodness for that. And having gone to the Stasi Museum, you see very, very clearly what that looked like. But is there something that places like Britain need to think about a place for state-owned enterprises, for planning, for more of a historical legacy of coming from socialism? I want to know if things look different in places like Leipzig that have experienced what they would call socialism, and places like Britain that haven't. And is Poland very different because of its particular experience of Solidarność and martial law? And what does that mean for this whole area of diverse economies, social and solidarity economies? What would happen if we are thinking of social democracy, perhaps thinking of basic income, basic services, so people are able to live well, and we can use these social and solidarity economy ways to make life more interesting, and also have conversations from a position of safety about what it means to live well. There's a wonderful book called Socialism After Hayek, which I'd recommend anybody interested in these ideas is interesting about. Is the issue that state-led socialism didn't take the entrepreneurial process seriously enough, didn't give any space for creating of wealth, assumed just the state will deliver everything to people because they're the only economic actor. We moved away from that in 1990, but do we need to have more broad social and solidarity-focused concepts around entrepreneurialism, about how to create wealth in more inclusive ways for the entrepreneurialism? And it might be that some of these can be cooperative. So I'm involved in a project with UK, Greece, Italy, and Spain, looking at developing models of social and solidarity economy incubators. So I won't go through the questions inspired by Leipzig, because I think I've already talked about those. I'll just leave you with this quote. In contrast with the common perception within the left in the past 2 centuries, today it's generally agreed that centralised socialist economies are neither feasible nor desirable, and we know that from Leipzig, as alternative systems to capitalism in the new millennium. We know how to make an economic system based on self-interest, but not how to make one based on generosity. Or do we? Walking around Leipzig just the last couple of days, I've seen all sorts of interesting spaces going on here. This was in the spring. This was just off Eisenbahnstrasse with... Actually, I saw that guy today. I recognise his haircut. Or perhaps that's I don't know, is that a normal Leipzig haircut? But seeing this going on, this was down in... I think was it Plagwitz, where we had that, went to that cafe? So I've seen all sorts of things going on in Leipzig. Are these places where these new social and solidarity economy ideas are being generated in a prefigurative way? People are practicing it. It's not good enough yet. But in the future, in the 21st century, when young people who are in their 20s now are in their 40s and 50s, who haven't experienced communism, don't believe in free market capitalism, what's that going to be like? Is it going to be really interesting? Or is this a scene? Come on, Pete, this is just normal life in Leipzig. Somebody said to me, so are you saying the way we organise things in Germany is perfect? Because it sure isn't. And I said, well, no, I'm not saying that. But is there something about Leipzig where some of these ideas are being developed in an interesting way, and they don't yet seem to be being neoliberalised like they are in Liverpool? Or is it that Liverpool went through its deindustrialisation in the 70s and the 80s and we're the other side of it? Berlin has changed. Leipzig is going to go through a process of gentrification over here. Is this just an alternative, funky, groovy form of capitalism, which the paranoid stance would say this is just capitalism, there's nothing interesting here? Well, I think there's a little bit more than that. Is this going to come together, as I think these people are, into a movement, perhaps a Polanyian counter-movement, to do something different? Or is it, as I tend to think, this is part of a diverse economy where we need to recognise that this is a scene, but it's no less important a scene than straight forms of employment for capitalism. And if these people get to a stage where they are supported into social entrepreneurship, alternative entrepreneurship, cooperative development, thinking about ways to live well, it's just the kind of place you can have those conversations. How do you want to live well in the Anthropocene? I think we might be starting to get somewhere. And I'll finish it there on what I hope is an optimistic note and open it up to your thoughts or your questions. Thank you.